You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at Nori, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change.
Hello and welcome to the Reversing Climate Change podcast with Nori. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm the creative editor at Nori, one of the co-founders there. Nori is a carbon removal marketplace based in Seattle. And today I have the pleasure of having Sandor Katz with me, author of many books such as The Art of Fermentation, and as Michael Pollan has referred to you, the Johnny Appleseed of fermentation. Welcome to the show, Sandor.
Thanks so much for having me on. Pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you too. I have spent so much time in your brain through your books. I've learned a lot. You've inspired me to ferment quite a lot of things. Sometimes it's taken over my life. I actually like that you have quite a lot of anecdotes about how sometimes you've overdone it and then your kitchen, your life has been ruled by microorganisms. Have you reined that in at this point, or have you just given into it?
Well, at this point, fermentation has been such a constant for half of my life now that, it's very unusual that I feel overwhelmed by it. It's a constant, and there's certain, sort of periods when I've been spending more time at home, when I sort of start more projects or do more experimentation. There's other times when I'm really busy and I'm like in and out and traveling a lot where, just by necessity, it's pared down. But, I wouldn't say that I've had any times in recent times where I've felt, overwhelmed by my ferments. I found like a very, happy balance of having them, maintaining them in my life. Actually, my computer that I'm talking to you through is sitting on top of a crock of soy sauce that's been fermenting for a year, and I keep it right on my kitchen counter because I try to stir it every day. And, when I'm out of town, I have a little sign that I put up next to it to remind the people I live with or the people house sitting for us to stir it every day. So certain of the things require, really kind of ongoing interaction, but most of them I can forget about for long periods of time, really.
Nice to hear that you have that, because for me, I used to do kombucha primarily, and I felt I would produce so much of it, and it wasn't good enough that I would want to drink all of it, but I felt pressure not to waste it. And then as soon as one batch was done, I wanted to get the SCOBY going in another one. And at some point I was producing way more than I could even give away.
Vinegar is a great solution for too much.
But I just would have had so much vinegar then. What do I do with all the vinegar? And then
everybody needs vinegar. You could clean your windows with vinegar. You can make salad dressing with vinegar. You can marinate things in vinegar. Nobody has too much vinegar.
I think releasing myself from the expectation of getting to 100% efficiency where there is always something fermenting, because much of it takes a while. So there's always a pressure, like the sooner you get it in, the faster it starts working. I'm sure you feel that in your soul, driving you a little bit too. But once I gave up on that, I've been doing more pickles and sauerkrauts, which I feel in smaller batches are much easier to consume pretty quickly and are a family favorite, especially pickles. Pickles I find to be, there's pressure to eat them, but it's a much easier ask than drinking a gallon of kombucha.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I love kombucha. I enjoy kombucha once in a while. Kombucha is no longer in my regular repertoire of things that I'm making in my kitchen. I'm just trying to stay away from sugary drinks, and for all the other things that kombucha is still a sugary drink. And, there's just so many ferments. And, my gateway into fermentation, my most sort of constant fermented companion has definitely been fermenting vegetables. And, it grew out of my gardening practice and as a practical way to, preserve abundance from certain moments in the garden. But I think it's a great thing that people in a small household can do on a very small scale. You don't need to make your sauerkraut in a 55-gallon barrel. You don't need to preserve a year's worth at a time, even if this is the way your great-great-grandparents were doing it, just because our context at the moment is different. And I think that, it's a real skill really with anything in the kitchen, but particularly with fermentation, just to scale it appropriately for your household.
Are there reasons that you consider important to ferment for beyond just I don't know. Why should someone even bother with this? Because it seems stinky. There's a lot of food prep. There's stuff that's being stored places that takes up space. Why not just buy everything? I mean, lots of people are making artisanal fermented products. Is it not better just to buy those?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's better, and really, I don't think it's worse. I mean, I'm really not on a mission to convince everybody that like they have to get interested in fermentation and start fermenting. Really, what I would say is a little bit of an inverse to that. Like, if anyone has the slightest interest or inkling to ferment, there's no reason for them to be afraid. There's no reason for them to be intimidated. And really, the thrust of my work is trying to demystify fermentation, sort of to empower people who are interested in doing it to do it. I'm not out to convince everybody that they have to start fermenting in their own kitchen, but I do think that there are a lot of great advantages. And, if we think about fermentation broadly, like there are always practical benefits to fermentation. Your food is not decomposing into a disgusting, ugly mess that nobody would ever put into their mouths. And instead, either you are preserving abundance from, one moment of the year to enjoy through other times. You might be making food more digestible. You might simply be making food more delicious. You might be producing alcohol, but, there's always practical benefits to fermentation. And it's also making food safer. I mean, fermentation above all else is a strategy for food safety. Now, in terms of why bother doing it yourself? I mean, for one, it's super fun and satisfying. And for another thing, if we want to think about it in terms of, microbial terroir. And, at this point, we understand that, every healthy human being is host to trillions of bacteria. And those bacteria play a huge role in, our physiological functioning. And, they enable us to effectively digest food. They synthesize essential nutrients inside of our bodies. They constitute much of what we describe as our immune systems. They, play a role in all kinds of biochemical regulation, including serotonin and other compounds that determine how we feel and how we think. And so, I guess I would encapsulate the relationship of fermentation to this is it has the potential to, restore and improve biodiversity in the gut, which can potentially improve any of those things. And I think, anyone can potentially benefit from incorporating fermented foods into their diet. But what's particular about, fermenting foods in your kitchen, fermenting the foods that you grew in your yard, fermenting foods that, farmers in your area have grown is that the microbial communities on the locally grown foods, they are your environment. And when you ferment at home with, foods that come from nearby, and then you eat those foods, you are quite literally becoming your environment. And I think it's an excellent strategy for, not, buying some generic, probiotic bacteria, at the nutritional supplement shop, but rather, sort of incorporating what's, sort of right around you into your diet. And I think that can be very powerful. Now, beyond that, there's an economic aspect to it too. I mean, there are excellent local and regional brands of fermented vegetables. I have friends 6 miles away who, make wonderful sauerkraut and kimchi, but I am constantly hearing people complaining about how much that costs. And so, they're outraged that a pint-sized jar of fermented vegetables is going to, cost them $10. And, it's really it's very easy. You can do it yourself. You could go buy, a pint-sized jar will take about a pound of vegetables. You can buy a pound of vegetables for, depending on what the vegetable and the season is, anywhere from, maybe 50 cents to a couple of dollars. You can shred those vegetables. You can put a couple of cents worth of salt on them. You can pound them and squeeze them a little bit to get them juicy. You can pack them into a jar that you have already in your kitchen from some other commercial food that you bought. And you can ferment it in that. And so for less than $1 up to a couple of dollars, you can make that pint of fermented vegetables yourself. So, like many things you could do yourself, it preserves resources and saves you money.
I think it's quite empowering too, to not merely be a consumer, but be involved in food production, especially as our civilization has become much more urbanized, much less connected to the land and making things. And many people work from computers and are not actually making anything tangible. The idea of participating in your own food system, I find to be really rewarding. It's a little scary at first too, because there is a concern, like, am I going to poison myself? But I think you try so hard in your books to say, there's not actually a lot of documented cases of this. It's pretty safe. Like, do not worry. But I think people, if they get their hands dirty in that, get some gochujang on your hands, it feels good.
Yeah. No, I am so with you on that. And I think that, a significant piece of the environmental destructiveness of our society has to do with, how little most of us have to do with, in terms of direct interaction with our environment. And, all food production is about interacting with plants and with animals and with microorganisms. And I think that the vast majority of us have, supposedly been liberated from that toil. But at the same time, it's created this profound sense of disconnection and alienation. And I agree wholeheartedly that, any kind of getting involved in food production, whether it's, growing some herbs in your windows, whether it's having a small garden, whether it's getting involved in a community garden, whether it's supporting local farmers by buying food at a farmer's market, whether it's, fermenting vegetables or other things in your home, can, really be profound in terms of, helping to make us, more connected to our environment. And then in terms of the safety, I just want to say, like, food does not get safer than fermented vegetables. And statistically speaking, fermented vegetables are much, much, much safer than raw vegetables because, we read every year about outbreaks of food poisoning stemming from raw vegetables. Last year it was red onions.
My uncle got sick from blueberries one year. Yeah.
But, clearly there's the possibility of an incidental contamination of raw produce. But if you ferment it, well, the lactic acid bacteria that are present on all plants growing out of soil on planet Earth, once you get the vegetable submerged in the way that you do it, the lactic acid bacteria will dominate every time. And if there happen to be some cells of E. coli, salmonella, other organisms that have the potential to make us sick, the very convenient fact for us is that the pathogens cannot survive in an acidic environment. And so acidifying vegetables just is about as safe as food gets.
That's a nice PSA for the listeners. One thing I catch both in the way that you speak, but also you're a little bit more explicit about it in fermentation as metaphor, something I associate with Ed Young and Lynn Margulis, that we sort of are larger. The anthropology that we've assumed to be the case, that we are individual, that we are a coherent being, is being challenged by the fact that there are trillions of microorganisms that complete metabolic processes for us, including ones that are cognitive in origin too, and that we're actually bigger than just this individual self that's been named. And within fermentation as metaphor, you have a sort of queer politics operating that's about fermentation as a way of understanding the dissolution of boundaries in some important way. Help fill in the gaps here. Am I onto something?
Yeah, sure. I think that I think that this is, a profound shift that is taking place in how we view ourselves. And, I think that there is this sort of long tradition of thinking of, the individual human being as this, sort of singular unit. And I think that, sort of science is showing us more and more the degree to which we are really these composite beings, and that, we have these trillions of microorganisms that we are host to, but they're not random and they're not parasitic and they're not freeloading. They exist in a symbiotic relationship with us. And, we could not possibly live without them. And I think that we're also learning that, sort of many of the, sort of emergent, sort of epidemic health problems have something to do with diminished biodiversity, in our bodies, and that we really need this biodiversity. And so, each human being is not a singular entity, but we are these sort of, massive, microbial universes. And, I don't want to take away anybody's sort of agency or anybody's, individual identity. But, what we can do and who we are is actually extremely complex and involves the collaboration of all these different kinds of organisms.
What would really change if you saw yourself more as a shepherd of the microbiome rather than an independent brain that operates unilaterally? Does that much really change spiritually, practically? Does anything really change?
I mean, sure. I mean, just in terms of our outlook and how we think about things and how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive our relationship to what is beyond us. So, I mean, sure. I mean, I imagine that there are people who, in their conception could sort of minimize the importance of that. I think that the growing recognition of that is shifting a lot. Like I learned this new word recently, which is lichenization. And, sort of science has long recognized that lichens are, not a singular life form, but that every lichen is a symbiosis. But we're realizing that that's true of pretty much every life form, that no life form is singular. And I think that, really, calls into question a lot of, our thinking and our ideas. And I think it really sort of strengthens the importance of, interdependence.
Has your learning about fermentation, in addition to your life story is quite fascinating as well, has that influenced the spiritual dimensions of how you approach your work? Is that even a thing for you? Do you have any sort of divine interest, or is that extraneous?
Well, I mean, I have been accused of being a spiritual couch potato.
Who called you that? That seems like a rude thing to call you.
A friend of mine long ago. But yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, for me, my practice of fermentation has really helped me to tune into unseen forces in our lives. And I think, fermentation has always been regarded as, a mystical phenomenon. And, fermentation is really very ancient. I mean, certainly, the way biologists talk about fermentation as anaerobic metabolism, the production of energy without oxygen, cells of our bodies are capable of fermentation. The earliest forms of life on Earth were fermenting organisms. And, as the symbiosis between different early organisms resulted in more complex cell structures, what are called eukaryotic cells, which is what all of the multicellular life forms are composed of. The multicellular life forms that they spawned have all had bacteria and other single cell organisms as part of them. So,
like the mitochondria, right? That's where that comes from.
Mitochondria, cell nuclei. But yeah, I mean, sort of one of the things that distinguishes the earliest cells, the prokaryotic cells, from the eukaryotic cells is that in the early cells, the genetic material is not contained in a nucleus. And actually that gives them this incredible genetic flexibility, which multicellular organisms do not possess, because the genetic material is in a nucleus and pretty much fixed for the life of the organism.
Species is maybe the incorrect paradigm for understanding much of the microbiota at this point too, right? Like that is also becoming, the boundaries are much fuzzier than we once thought.
Sure. No, I mean, especially for bacteria, which have this incredible shape-shifting ability, this genetic flexibility, this ability to, take in and release and exchange genetic material. I mean, many microbiologists really are coming to the conclusion that, our concept of species, which we developed to describe animals and plants, really is an inappropriate way to describe bacteria, because there's so much genetic flexibility and shape shifting among them. Now, I'm certainly not trained as a microbiologist. I am not in a position to sort of have a nuanced view of this debate, but I am well aware that this is a debate in the field of microbiology, is just how appropriate is this conception that we have of species to bacteria.
So much of human knowledge is based around having stable categories. And I wonder what happens when we lose the ability to speciate in a meaningful way. How does one even practice science with so many confounding, interacting variables where you don't have stable categories? It kind of hurts my brain to think about what might emerge next. How does one even do that?
Science is never fixed. We're always like learning more that's sort of changing our conception of things. And, I think we have no choice but to, sort of be open to the, new information we have and, consider that our, earlier conceptions of, how things are organized were imperfect. And, we need to, use our observational skills. I remember where I was going earlier. I got into how I was talking about how ancient fermentation is.
Oh, that's right.
And that in a certain sense, it goes back to the earliest life on Earth in terms of a human cultural practice of fermentation. There's an archaeological record that demonstrates that the practice of fermentation is at least 10,000 years old from pottery shards in China. But really, I would say that only tells us about the history of pottery, not about the history of fermentation, because presumably the earliest vessels that people used for fermentation were all things that are totally biodegradable, from various animal membranes to wood, hollowed out wooden structures, gourds. But, any of the earliest kinds of vessels would biodegrade. But we do have pottery showing us that there's an intentional human practice of fermentation going back at least 10,000 years. And fermentation is practiced everywhere. And, my general idea about why is fermentation practiced everywhere is, the simple fact that microbiology has illuminated for us that, all of the plants and all of the animals and all of the animal products that make up our food are populated by microorganisms. So there's a certain inevitability to microbial transformation. And, without specifically knowing about bacteria, because, science really only began to have a firm idea about bacteria about 150 years ago, without even knowing about bacteria, people developed, incredibly elaborate range of techniques for working with them. And the way that I, envision it is that, just as a practical matter, people observed under what conditions does food decompose into a disgusting, ugly mess that nobody would ever put into their mouths, and under what contrasting conditions does the food improve in some kind of a tangible way, and whether it's becoming more delicious, becoming more easily digestible, becoming more stable for storage. And and this question of storage, I think, is really I think it's relevant and not unrelated to the topic of your podcast, and that is, for people living in the 21st century, particularly in the more affluent parts of the world, we have a refrigerator. And so people are used to preserving food in the refrigerator or in the freezer, or we have these, techniques which are really relatively recent in the scheme of things, like, using heat and pressure to, preserve things in a sterile way in a jar that, we call canning. In English. In French, they call it appertization because they remember the name of Nicolas Appert, the clever Frenchman who early in the 19th century discovered this process. But our refrigerators, I keep a lot of things in the refrigerator. I keep the yogurt that I make in the refrigerator because I have the refrigerator. But, the fresh milk that we grew up with, it was something that only people living on dairy farms ever had access to before the 20th century. And, it became the popular way to consume milk because of refrigeration, because it was possible. But, in all of the parts of the world where there's a tradition of people raising animals for their milk, there are fermented forms of milk, and whether that's yogurt or kefir or cheese, these all are practical strategies for preserving milk. And now, a hard cheese like a Parmesan cheese or a cheddar cheese, really a big block of that is stable for years, outside of refrigeration. With yogurt, it might not be years, it might be weeks. If you don't keep it in the refrigerator, the bacteria will continue to make it more sour. So the flavor will become more intensely sour as the days and weeks go on. But, that sourness only makes it safer because, the pathogens can't survive in an acidic environment. So, I think it's really hard for people in our time to even conceptualize how they would feed themselves without this, sort of energy guzzling machine. But, obviously people do and people did. And, most people on planet Earth do not have a refrigerator in 2023. And, and we still have an incredible amount of wisdom, cultural legacies from every part of the world and how to feed ourselves, how to preserve food, without the benefit of this machine. And I'm not encouraging people to throw away their refrigerators, but, it's certainly conceivable that, there will be a moment when, energy will not be as widely available, will not be as cheap as it is now, and that refrigerators will not be so widespread. And it really behooves us to hold on to this cultural wisdom.
I wonder how our health would change as a species if we were less reliant upon refrigeration and other preservation techniques, and we're more reliant upon fermentation. Surely it'd be a healthier human community.
Yeah, there's so many potential health benefits to fermented foods. And I don't want to say that fermented foods are superior to fresh foods. I mean, I do not espouse that belief at all. I mean, really, I think that there's nothing better and more luscious and more satisfying than, really fresh food. But the reality is in most places, we just cannot feed ourselves through the year, day in, day out with fresh food. To some degree, we have to be reliant on different preservation methods. And, fermentation is not the only ancient preservation method. I mean, drying food, certain kinds of foods, in their mature state, they're dried. Any kind of grain, any kind of bean, any kind of nut. And so, to preserve these foods, we don't need a refrigerator and we don't necessarily need to ferment them. And when people ferment them, they're like, nobody ever ferments a bean or a grain in order to preserve it. People ferment beans and grains in order to unlock their nutritive potential. They ferment them in order to make them more delicious. They ferment them in order to make them lighter. I mean, think about bread. If bread wasn't fermented, it would be dense like a brick. And what gives bread its lightness and its pleasant texture is the lifting. It's the bubbles of carbon dioxide that form inside the loaf and lift it up. Also a lot of these sort of dense foods like a soybean or a grain of wheat, like they can preserve for very long periods of time as long as you keep them dry, but their density and some of the protective, what I would call anti-nutrient compounds that they have in order to, discourage critters from eating them so that they can, potentially fulfill their evolutionary destiny of germinating and reproducing. But they can be very difficult for us to digest. And so, the fermentation breaks down a lot of these anti-nutrient compounds. And, in the case of soybeans, which are the plant source food with the most protein, our human bodies, can't break it down to absorb that protein. So the Asian cultures that developed soy agriculture thousands of years ago recognized the indigestibility of the soybeans. If you try to eat just a bowl of cooked soybeans for dinner, you're going to have terrible indigestion and gas, and you're not going to get very much protein out of them. And so, all of these different traditions emerged of fermenting the soybeans in different ways. And the fermentation doesn't preserve them, but it pre-digests them. It breaks down the proteins into amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. And this, not only makes the nutrients more accessible, but it makes them flavorful. And it takes an otherwise, very mild, somewhat insipid food and gives it all of this incredible character and flavor.
We've also danced a little bit around this and you haven't addressed it directly, but I've also seen the beer first theory of civilization that actually settlement in a permanent capacity. I think in Egypt is where this is supposed to have happened. People settled in order to produce beer, like regular supplies of beer. So like there's also that side of fermentation too. Is that responsible for us having permanent settled civilizations?
Well, I mean, I think that, this is certainly a debate, within the field of archaeology. But I mean, I think it's pretty clear that like sort of, civilizations emerged out of grain agriculture. And the Chinese civilization emerged around rice agriculture. And in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, it was around wheat agriculture. And in the Americas, it was around corn agriculture. And in Africa, it was around millet agriculture. So, different grains in different places. But, the significance of grains is this thing that I mentioned, that they are so stable and storable. And so, sort of this gave rise to the idea of like growing lots and storing it. And it also, gave rise to, the idea of accumulations of wealth and, sort of rulers being able to rule large numbers of people. But then there's a question of, well, what did people do with these grains? And, bread, which is, almost synonymous with sustenance in a Western context, is one explanation. But then, beer is another thing you can do with it. But, what I would say is that, in all of the parts of the world where civilizations grew out of grain agriculture, the grains were used both for alcoholic beverages and for food. So to me, it's a little bit of an academic debate. However, if people in their earlier, migratory patterns were reasonably well fed, it does seem to me that a more compelling reason to change your way of life is, because of this, mind altering alcoholic beverages that you could now produce more so than bread. But I think that there's definitely room for debate about this question, and there has been plenty of it.
Oh, certainly. It's a fun one to think about. One thing I've noticed in your writing and speaking to you now is that you are quite passionate about fermentation and fermented foods, but you're also a rather humble evangelist as well. I feel you often carve out space for saying like, well, you can buy things store-bought, or you also tell stories in your books about how people will assume that you're a raw vegan, or like you have other sorts of very strong food preferences. That there's something about food that makes us focus on purity and exclusion in a really powerful way. I don't know what it is about food politics that are so intense, but there's something I think you identified almost as fascistic in a way, a politics of purity around food. What happens with our brains and food? It really drives us nutty.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know. I really just try not to be dogmatic about food. And I'm not dogmatic about diet. I mean, I definitely have ideas and preferences, but, I also see that people around the world eat in a lot of different ways. And so, if you like, okay, plant-based diet. I mean, I love vegetables. I mean, I love to eat vegetables. I crave vegetables. It doesn't mean that I don't eat meat. I helped a friend of mine raise a couple of pigs, and I ended up with all of this fat. And I've been using lard, but like, oh my God, a spoonful of lard in, sauteing vegetables just adds incredible flavor to it. And I think sometimes, we talk about diet isn't like, either every day you have to eat or every meal you have to eat a giant slab of meat, or you're vegan. And the thing is, in most cultural contexts, people have used meat in relatively small amounts to, enhance their primarily plant-based diets. But not everywhere. I mean, I've become friendly with this woman who is a microbiologist from Greenland. And, the Greenland diet has, virtually no, or the traditional Greenland diet has, virtually no plant food. But eating the organs of animals, of fish and marine mammals and animals is considered essential, including, the contents of the intestine, which is generally digested plants. So, I think that, it's terrible for us to sort of like have these sort of abstracted ideas of how everybody needs to eat, when clearly there are examples of populations where just based on, the foods that are abundant in their environment, they have sort of worked out strategies for survival in very different ways. And I think, what's clear for me as someone who's, just been interested in how people in different places eat is that human beings are extremely versatile, and we can survive and we can thrive on very different kinds of diets. And it always strikes me as absurd when people are promoting like a singular kind of a diet that's like the only way to be healthy. And I think that there's a lot of different ways we can be healthy and a lot of different examples of how people eat. And I think, ultimately a lot of it comes down to, balance and how we sort of, balance out the different foods that we eat, and I think that, people sometimes project also like magical powers on foods. I just was talking to a friend of mine, like what a triggering thing it is for me when people talk about superfoods. There's this berry from, this faraway part of the world. And, if we could just eat this berry every day, then, it'll solve all of our problems. And I just think that's just completely, unrealistic. And I think the whole idea of superfoods is just like a marketing ploy. And that's not to say that there aren't like nutritionally powerful kinds of foods, but in every environment, there are nutritionally powerful kinds of foods. And of course, a singular food, including sauerkraut. Sauerkraut is an incredible food. I love to eat sauerkraut, but, to say that like, oh, if you eat sauerkraut every day, all your problems are going to go away is just completely unrealistic, because thinking that one food is going to change everything in the context of everything else you do, it's like, okay, well, what else are you eating along with the sauerkraut? And never mind what you're eating, what are you doing? How active are you being? How, contented and happy are you? How good is the sleep that you're getting? Our health is just an outcome of all of these different factors. And to think that like one singular factor is going to be like the determining factor, I think it's very reductionistic. And I think that, a lot of the dietary movements that we see are, just imagining if only you could get the food right, everything else would follow. And diet is important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not discounting the importance of what we eat, but I just don't think there are singular reductionistic answers. And yeah, sure. A lot of dietary movements can be very, very puritanical. For me personally, that just puts me off. And, I have these friends who, follow this intense, like raw food diet. And they really believe that like sort of human culture all around the world made a critical error thousands of years ago in applying fire to food, that sort of all human cultural traditions are wrong. And that, sort of somehow, their all raw dietary movement got it right. And these are friends of mine. I like them. It doesn't mean I agree with everything they say, but I have just huge respect for human cultural traditions. That's really, my obsession with fermentation is really sort of ultimately an interest in, in these human cultural traditions of how we use food and all those sort of diverse approaches to it. And, if we're going to say human cultural traditions are all like wrong, then, we might as well say like language is all wrong.
Some people do say that, like John Zerzan is like, we got to go back to primitivism, go back to pre-symbolic language. There are people out there saying that.
Okay, well, I beg to disagree.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, okay, we don't want to be reductionistic here, but maybe one reduction you might permit is that when you do ferment something and it's homemade, you have a polyculture of many, many different types of microorganisms, where if you buy something commercially fermented, it might be a single strain of FDA approved probiotic added that is not indigenous to the substrate that it's going into necessarily. Like the diversity is the important thing that homemade fermenting might foster, where commercial fermenting might neglect. So in some ways, they might even be too different, and we might be able to reduce to say homemade is often better than commercially bought. Would you allow that?
Sure, but I mean, I would say like, okay, like one of the things that I make regularly is yogurt. And the first years that I was making yogurt, I would go to the store, I'd buy a little like the smallest container of plain whole milk yogurt, and I'd use that as a starter. And my first batch, as long as I got the temperature manipulation part right, my first batch would always be beautiful and thick and luscious. And then if I used that as a starter for a next batch, it was never quite as good the second time. And by the third generation, it always just was gone. I mean, it was homemade, but I was starting from a commercial culture. And, it turns out that, the early microbiologists were terrified of biodiversity and the biodiversity of a lot of traditional fermented foods. And that, your traditional yogurts had these sort of wide variety of bacteria in them. And the early microbiologists set out to identify which ones were absolutely functionally necessary to make yogurt. And they basically isolated out 2 organisms out of this big mass of unknown organisms. And, all commercial yogurt is based on those 2 single strains of organisms. They make beautiful yogurt, but they're not really able to sustain themselves generation after generation because they lack an evolved structure with essentially defense mechanisms. Whereas the traditional yogurts, which are these evolved communities, have structures to maintain themselves generation after generation. So, eventually I got a hold of what I would describe as an heirloom yogurt culture. This one's originally from Romania via, New York and the UK, and then back to where I live in Tennessee. But, a lot of people, I mean, you could there's people selling little white powder to make sauerkraut. There's people making homemade sauerkraut who think that they need this little white powder. So, for me, the defining characteristic isn't necessarily simply, is it homemade, but it's like, how are you making it? There's people making cheeses at home that are adding pure culture starters. And by the way, I mean, I'm not against the use of pure culture starters. I mean, I think that, in certain applications, they can be extremely practical. But, they're a phenomenon of the 20th century. And, all fermentation until the 20th century was, relying either on wild fermentation or what I would describe as backslopping, which is when you take a scoop of the previous yogurt and introduce it into the new yogurt. It's maintain your sourdough starter by taking a little scoop of the sourdough and adding it to fresh flour and water. So, there are, ancient means of perpetuation beyond wild fermentation. Wild fermentation is, it's the name of my first book about fermentation, but it's also throughout the literature used to describe, any kind of fermentation based on the organisms that are present on that food or to a limited degree in the environment. So, to me, that was the more important distinction. And, there are people producing various kinds of ferments on a commercial scale using wild fermentation. And then there's some people making things at home using pure culture starters.
And if you compare something like the Georgian winemaking traditions or natural winemaking generally, or wild fermentation of beer, the variability by vintage, I think, is quite high relative to a commercial yeast, which sometimes there's magic in a bottle. Like there's nothing else like it when it's good. And there's also some where you're like, this whole case is bad and needs to be thrown in the garbage, essentially.
Well, I think that that's one of the reasons why people find, especially in the context of large scale production, people find pure culture starters to be so helpful, because there definitely is more variability in wild fermentation. But I would say in every realm of fermentation, whether we're going to talk about, wines or cheeses or breads or salamis or sauerkrauts, in every realm of fermentation, the most delicious examples you can find in the world, the greatest practitioners are always working with wild fermentation. But as you say, there's greater variability and there's more potential for problems. And, really the reason why Louis Pasteur was highly hired by, a winemaker to start investigating fermentation had to do with the Industrial Revolution and scaling up. And if, winemakers from, the earliest practitioners thousands of years ago, had this incredible variability, well, in the Industrial Revolution, as people were scaling up, that variability made the stakes higher. And so, the pure culture starters made it all much more predictable and much more consistent. And, and that has its benefit. But, it's still amazing to taste the incredible complex flavors, of a wonderful raw milk cheese, or, just incredible flavor of a delicious sourdough loaf of bread, or, some of the styles of beer that are relying on wild fermentation. And, I think that, generally the most outstanding examples are made by wild fermentation.
I respect that you acknowledge trade-offs so strongly. It's sadly not as common as one might think. Why aren't you more of a partisan or ideologue? I think someone might have expected that of you. Why do you shirk this duty?
Well, I mean, I use pure culture starters. It's like I make tempeh and I use starters for the tempeh. And I don't know, I think that, fermentation, like food, grows out of particular places. And, if you want to experiment widely and, certain kinds of vegetables, I have to, employ technology in order to grow them in my environment. I have to, use row covers that extend the season or something like that. And certain kinds of ferments I just couldn't possibly make in my environment, an environment where they're not indigenous to, without some kind of technological assist. So, I don't think that, I guess I just can't help myself. I mean, I just see, I see multiple sides of these things. And, for myself, like I haven't used a packet of yeast in, more than 25 years. It's not that I think the packet of yeast is evil. I just think like, well, okay, everything that the packet of yeast could ferment, anything sugary, any kind of fruit, any kind of grain already has yeast on it. And so, I'm just more interested in the magic of sort of like, bringing the yeast that's already on these substrates to life. But, I don't want to pretend that it's just, some, evil conspiracy that's encouraging people to use them. It's just like, I can appreciate ease and quickness, and why sort of, somebody who's working too hard but still likes to make their own bread would want to use yeast and just be able to have the process be done in 2 or 3 hours and live with bread that doesn't have as much flavor complexity.
If someone is listening and they haven't done any fermentation before, or at least that they know about, where do you recommend people start?
Well, I mean, I'll suggest my books are a good place to start. Wild fermentation is probably the most accessible introduction. The art of fermentation is, much more thorough and in depth. My latest book is called Fermentation Journeys, and that's about fermented foods and beverages that I've learned about in my travels in recent years. I'm glad that you brought up fermentation as metaphor. That's not going to really teach you much about the practical aspects of fermentation, but if you want to think about some of the implications of fermentation and some of the ways that in the English language we use the word fermentation to describe any kind of bubbly, excited phenomenon, then check out that book. I have another book that I don't know if you even know about called The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved: Inside America's Underground Food Movements. And this is about, various grassroots movements to reclaim our food. So, you can start with my books, but there's a lot of resources out there. I mean, you can just search on the internet and find like lots of recipes. I have a website, wildfermentation.com, with links to all kinds of fermentation related resources out there on the World Wide Web. More and more you can find classes in different locales of, people sharing their skills at fermentation. The internet's full of videos, like YouTube videos, how to make sauerkraut, how to make kimchi, how to make koji, how to make anything. So, the resources are out there, and, just try to, get over whatever kind of anxiety you might be projecting onto the process and give it a try.
Honestly, it's so much easier than you think. It's the same with in cooking. You can often substitute time for skill. Like you could do a braise, which is mostly prep work, or if you brine a chicken a couple days ahead of time with salt and buttermilk, like you can look like a competent chef. I feel like fermenting is often like that too. A lot of it's prep and waiting the correct amount of time, and it's easier than you might think. I find your work to be very accessible and encouraging because it is trying to demystify it. It is something that literally anyone can do.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I just keep on reminding myself and reminding other people that like these processes were not worked out by microbiologists in laboratories. These were worked out thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, in the kitchens of people who most likely have a much less technology than you have in your kitchen. And, you don't need a lot of special fancy equipment. If you really get into it, I mean, ceramic crocks and other specialized equipment, certainly can make it easier to do large amounts of things. But, for small amounts of fermenting vegetables, jars that you already have in your kitchen are your friend. And as you point out, it takes time. It takes a little bit of advanced planning, and certain ferments like the soy sauce that my computer is sitting on right now, that might take a year or longer. But, most ferments really, happen in the course of a week or a couple of weeks, or, some of them like, yogurt, I usually ferment my yogurt for about 8 hours. Most commercial yogurt is only fermented for about 2.5 hours. So, the fermentation byproducts accumulate over time. And if you like things stronger, then you need to wait longer. But if you prefer things with milder flavors, then you can really generally enjoy them relatively quickly.
Very encouraging. Well, Sandor, thanks so much for being here with me. It's a true pleasure to have you on. I've learned so much from you, and thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be with you.
And thanks for listening. If you like what we do here, hey, please give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps us a lot. It's one thing you can do to help the show. Send this to a friend. And hey, thanks again so much for spending time with us. Have a lovely day. Thank you so much for listening. If you could please subscribe and give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, that'd be much appreciated. It helps us get our content out to more people. You can sign up for our newsletter at nori.com, follow us on social media, and we will catch you next time.